All right. Nice to see some friends in the audience. As somebody who was born in segregated housing on the south side of Chicago, at the time these events were taking place, this was riveting, and it was heartbreaking. My name is Steve Bumbaugh, and I'm the Senior Vice President of College, Career, and Digital Access at the College Board. My job is to give underrepresented students access to academic resources that change their trajectories so that we can start compensating for the sort of thing that happened to their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents all over this country of ours. I'd also like to take a moment and introduce some of my colleagues. I'd like to introduce Barbara Cronin, who is the Vice President of Governance, Membership, and Access Initiatives. Thank you for being here, Barbara. Lorraine Hastings is the Vice President of Counselor Engagement. And Paula Baez Perez is my right hand, an executive assistant at the College Board. So our team is in the Vineyard this week to have conversations about some important new work that we're undertaking. The College Board is in the process of launching an advanced placement, an AP, African American Studies course, which is going to allow, thank you. We've been going all over the country for the last couple of years talking to folks about this course, and what we hear over and over from adults is, I wish I had had that course when I was in high school. So if you have children, if you have nieces or nephews or grandchildren, this course is likely coming to a public school near you soon, and make sure they take it. We think we're probably going to have hundreds of thousands of students in this course, and it's not just for Black students, it's for all students. This is the history of all of us, not just African Americans. We're happy to moderate a conversation today on Shame of Chicago because it's an example of a story about African Americans that should be widely known, but is not. So let's get started with Shame of Chicago. Christopher Jenkins is an old friend of mine, and he is also an award-winning journalist, documentary film producer, social justice warrior. His focus has been on race, class, and equity. Chris is the producer and writer of many works, including the award-winning documentary Trapped, Cash Bail in America, streaming on YouTube Originals. He's the producer of the forthcoming film Anthem, to be released by Disney, and of course, he is the producer and writer of Shame of Chicago. We're going to talk about that a little bit. I would also like to introduce Dr. Brandi Waters. Brandi is the Senior Director and Program Manager of AP African American Studies at College Board. That means she is the primary architect of this course. Before joining the College Board, Brandi served as a coordinator for the International Network of Afro-Latin American, Afro-Caribbean, and Diaspora Women, a nonprofit organization based in Nicaragua. And she has a double PhD in African American Studies and Latin American Studies from Yale. We're going to ask Dr. Waters to join our conversation. So we're going to have a conversation for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So get your questions ready. Chris Jenkins.
Steve Bumbaugh.
We're going to start with you. So social justice has been the cornerstone of your work for over 20 years. You say that Shame of Chicago is a reckoning with the truth and is about educating the community and repairing the past. What attracted you to this story as a New York boy? And why is it important for us to learn this history?
So thanks, Steve. Great to be with Brandi, and thanks again to Martha's Vineyard African American Film Festival for hosting this. So just as by way of context, Bruce Orenstein, who sort of is from Chicago and started this project a few years ago, called me last year, showed me this episode when he was developing it. And immediately I saw what is the most important thing to me as a storyteller, which is trying to blend rigorous, fact-based and data-driven journalism or filmmaking with people's stories. And combining that with a journalist flair for telling stories that are accessible to the public. And our vision, as we've developed it, at least as I've been on for the last year or so, is to find that model everywhere we go as we trace the history of residential housing segregation in Chicago. So how do you find the power in some of the data that you saw, the unassailable data that scholars have worked on for the last 20 years, and combine that with finding voices. And I gotta say, I hadn't seen that episode in a couple of months. I've been working on the other episodes, and I don't know if it was rage or just the empathy of listening to all these black folks telling their stories, tears welling up in my eyes with, because that's the power of what we were able to do with series like this, when we try to put everything in a gumbo between people's stories and the data and the journalists who are covering it. Ta-Nehisi obviously kicked a lot of this stuff off when he wrote that piece 10 years ago in The Atlantic. And so being able to do these kinds of stories, whether it was my bail film, which again tried to blend data with people's stories and in an accessible way, is sort of what I saw with the ability to be able to sit and really get into the history and find archival and find these voices. But I think a lot of this speaks for itself as to why this is important, right? I think, we talked last night, Steve, and I know you'll talk a little bit about this later with Brandi, about the mythology of American history that we all learned for a certain age, coming to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whenever we went to high school, this one-note arc of what happened not only in American history, but America's impact on the world, and the impact it's had on people. But in this case, I think when we learned, at least when I learned American history, you have slavery, you have the civil rights movement, and you don't have anything in between. Now, that may be changing now. It's obviously going to change with what Steve's doing and Brandi's doing. But hearing these voices of how black people were always pushing back, were always fighting, that you never learned in high school, you never learned in college unless you took some advanced seminar in African American studies. Listening to Clyde, Betsy, and all these people and what they were doing is the heart of sort of what I have tried to do through my entire career, whether I was a social worker, whether I was a journalist, now as a filmmaker, is how do you lift individual voices, put them into the fore, and then put context around them so that we can understand the meaning of their lives in the general context of American history. And so that's what attracted me to this project, was the opportunity to do that. And I may not have mentioned earlier, but this is the third episode in the 5-part series. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but we trace the entire 20th century in Chicago and how this came to be in the 50s, through the first decade of the 20th century, and then through the second decade, and then we'll get to this in the fifth decade and so on. So we really try to trace the entire arc of how we got here with the third episode, but really, again, to unmask and shatter these myths that we have been told over the years about what exactly American history is, and even what black history is, and black experience is in our country.
So one of the things that was probably obvious to most of the people watching this film is that it was like we were living in an upside-down world, right? Mm-hmm. The bad guys, the speculators, which is a pithy euphemism for the thieves, were supported by all the institutions of power. The banks gave them credit, the police came to protect them, and the good guys, the folks who were forced to pay more than they should, all of these systemic obstacles that their tax dollars paid for were out to get them. Was there ever any atonement for the people who were burning down buildings and collecting insurance payments and treating
No.
folks from our parents' generation like this.
No, never has been. I mean, I don't know if anyone's familiar with, coincidentally, there is a movement in Evanston, Illinois right now to do a small reparations program, which is not 100% connected to this story, but to these individual people. But, more broadly, this obviously happened all over the country. So Chicago was a leader, as we'll explore in some of our other episodes, about how Chicago led the way in which the residential segregation was instituted was led by Chicago. But St. Louis, Detroit, as Ta-Nehisi says, Cleveland, Los Angeles, all these places, had the same kind of issues around these kinds of contract buying. But no, the short answer is no, there was not any kind of repair. What these folks did on their own was the only kind of pushback. It's been lost, I think, to many of us in the dustbin of history, unfortunately, which is part of the reason why obviously we're doing this. But, these are the conversations we're having now. Again, led, I think, to some degree, I think in the popular imagination by Ta-Nehisi in his piece last year, but there are scholars all over the country now, Derek Hamilton at New School, Sandy Darity was one of our advisors at Duke, who are trying to figure out where do we start to begin to look at targeted reparations in certain situations for people who were kept out of the housing market by design, whether it was redlining or housing covenants, housing contracts like we saw here. It's a slow local movement, obviously. I'm sure everybody here is aware of the conversations around reparations, but that's a lot of where that conversation is located, particularly by scholars. It's not so much about slavery, at least for many people, although that's a whole other conversation. It is about this. It is about the systematic and what we know to be institutional racism. I mean, that's the definition of what we saw here. But this is what so many people like Professor Hamilton, like I mentioned at New School and so on, are really targeting, is these kind of practices, this part of American history, not 200 years ago, 60 years ago, just 2 generations ago. The Chicago Tribune does a story in 1973. I was alive in 1973, so this is not ancient history, about what was going on. I think that's where some of the conversation around reparations are being located.
So often when we are, as a country, asked to reconcile some of the more difficult aspects of Black history, the pushback is, oh, that's the past, get over it, move forward. Chris and Brandi, can you think of any parallels that are happening today, parallels to this film?
Well, sure, and also I want to take an opportunity to thank the organizers of this wonderful film festival. It's such a wonderful opportunity for us to be here again, to really host another conversation about how this new course is also tied into the works that you're producing. And I think what's really a bigger reckoning across the country, that there is more for us to learn. There's more that we need to know, and that the stories are even bigger than what we've imagined. So I can see parallels here, not only with the history of housing in the very recent past, but also the ways that millennials are thinking about addressing housing right now. There is a racial conversation to what's happening in terms of economic development, educational disparities, and also health disparities. All of these things are extensions of the past that kind of appear in new ways and create those kinds of parallels that you mentioned today.
All right, I'm going to ask you a deep question, Brandi. You are a trained historian. I am merely a lay historian. I observe that American history is often presented more as mythology than as a set of facts, much the way we have Greek mythology and Norse mythology. It seems that these myths often serve as a form of nostalgia, as Clint Smith puts it, where a set of events and people are deified and made superior. As a historian, setting out to present a set of facts in our AP African American Studies course, do you think that, well, tell me, what is the power of stripping away that mythology?
That's a great question. I think one element of the power of stripping away the mythology is that it puts everyone on an even playing field. And it really encourages you to look at a particular person in history, whether it's someone like a founding father or someone like an enslaved person, for their humanity, for their failures, for their successes. So it encourages us to look at people all in the same playing field and to really analyze what has happened and not just see them first in a position of power or disempowerment.
Is that a form of equity?
Yes. I think it's an equitable way at looking at the past, and it's also an equitable way of thinking about how the past reverberates in the present.
But just to add to that, Steve, I mean, the reason why politically in our present there is so much pushback to this history is because we are destroying their myths, right? I mean, why would you call slaves immigrants in Texas or whatever they're trying to call them? Like, you know, I can't remember the term, something about, they're trying to call them indentured servants or something, right? Not slaves. You know, what is, you know, why do they call people like Brandi and me woke when they're trying to demonize people they're trying to find a name who are, as we try to present facts as opposed to myth, who are the myth makers, what are the myth makers trying to do? They're trying to push back on those myths being destroyed by demonizing, you know, those of us who are trying to bring, you know, facts to the fore and to upend and tell the truth about the myth that is. That is the political conversation that we're obviously all in right now. And so that's why, you know, this is so important. What you guys are doing is so important generationally. You know, one thing I have to say, I mean, I get in these conversations sometimes with friends about, you know, what do we do next? Like, do we keep fighting? Do we leave? Like, you know, the architecture of America isn't changing. Like, what do we do? Like, you know, and I sit and look at Clyde Ross and the sisters who were fighting, and the first woman, who's Betsy, who stands up and says, I, you know, will tell my story. To me, that's the reason why we continue to be here and do the things we do, right? Is because those people with less advantages, less everything that we have right now, sat and fought and couldn't go anywhere and did what they did in order to shatter those myths. And so, that doesn't directly answer your question, but just speaking to what you're talking about, narratives and equity, you know, those stories, not the fact that we did it, but those individual stories are the reason why we do what we do, because we have to honor that incredible fight. I mean, just think about that. I mean, a year, 2 years, 10. I mean, that Clyde Ross thing was a 12-year fight. You know, 1970, he's still fighting. He bought the house in 1958. 12 years fighting. I mean, it's just, you know, so anyway, sorry, Steve.
I'm gonna depart from our script. That's what makes these kind of conversations fun. So, when we move away from the mythology and we present these facts about which most Americans are unaware, it's pretty clear what some of our white American friends think they're going to lose. But when a narrative, essentially, of heroism. But when we are putting together these courses, Brandi, when we're putting together the films like the ones that you produce, Chris, what do those people who are so afraid of giving up the myth, what do they have to gain by a set of facts, a narrative that hews more closely to the truth?
I won't speak for, you know, what those people necessarily feel or think or what they feel as if they have to gain. I mean, I think, if there is some kind of sense about the American exceptionalism, and, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones does, you know, incredible work in trying to shatter this notion of what American exceptionalism really means. And she says, obviously, that it's not true. It's a myth. What we gain is a sense of really, of bringing that sense of American exceptionalism to a full sense of what it's supposed to be, what they say it is, right? And that sounds very academic, because ultimately what everyone's afraid of is losing something. I mean, most people are scared of losing something, right? Losing, you know, wealth or losing slots in a school or whatever it is. But speaking about the truth of what America is, that's what you gain. I mean, is the sense about what the July 4th, 1776 is all about, you know, is a sense of American exceptionalism, the sense that we are exceptional people who are able to democratize and be truly a multicultural, equitable world. I mean, that's essentially what the 1619 Project is trying to say through all the work that Nicole has done. And so I think to the extent to which, you know, that is an academic and maybe existential question, I do think that's the truth. You know, that's what you gain from the world. And, you know, obviously that's the battle that we're in right now, you know, every night, you know, listening to Tucker Carlson and trying to fight back, throw bananas at the television, whatever it is that we do in order to, you know, that's the fight, you know, is to bring a sense of what truly American democracy is.
I think there are a few other things that they stand to gain. And for me, it reminds me of the emperor's new clothes. So this kind of mythology that folks wear as armor, It's the thing that they put against someone else. It's the thing that they use to shield themselves and to protect themselves. When they see it for a falsehood, they actually have something to gain. So they're not just losing this kind of false clothing, but they're gaining an opportunity to stand on more firmer ground. They're gaining an opportunity to not be locked into a very simplistic version of history without nuance. They're gaining the freedom to be able to talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, the failures, and to participate in a more inclusive way of building a new world. So it means that you don't have the burden of being the hero in all of the narratives, while all of these other people are showing that that is not true. You have this opportunity to kind of shed yourself of that mythology and move into something new with more people working together. So I think that that's a part of what I would hope that folks can see as an opportunity to shed when we are not beholden to these really problematic mythologies that are also not airtight. I mean, that's not a sustainable strategy. So I encourage folks who are holding on to those things to first shed themselves of the fear, let go of the mythology, and participate with more people at the table in really understanding what has happened from a fact-based perspective.
Yeah, because ultimately, I mean, as you think about sort of the problems in white America now as it relates to drug addiction or loss of jobs. These are things that black people have been dealing with for decades. And we always say that, you know, black folks are the canaries in the mine, you know, to some degree. And when it comes to the American economy, you know, when black, you know, folks have, what's the phrase? When white America has the flu, black folks have pneumonia. I mean, that's, you know, that there is, and so now white folks are having pneumonia because, you know, there has been this concerted effort, mainly by the right, to separate people by class. And so there's the academic things we're talking about, but there's also the issues in white America as it relates to poverty and increasing death rates, suicide are all part of how banks, which is one of the great things I think about this piece that Bruce and I put together, is that there's always a shadow hand of banks, of oligarchs, as Ta-Nehisi has said over and over again, like who are essentially, you know, pitting all these groups below us, to, you know, against each other around race and all these other things. And so, honestly, I mean, you know, folks who listen to Tucker Carlson, of course, may not agree with this, but they have their own financial and future to gain by understanding this history to the extent to which they can understand that it's not us who are preventing them from doing anything. It is these systems that are doing things to the entire non-oligarch world, pushing people apart from each other, and then as people lose their wealth, their health, and so on, that's what they have to gain actually on a more, to me, brass tacks level.
And by the way, there are some interesting parallels between what we saw in this film and what everybody in this room lived through in 2008, 2009 with the housing crisis. And that was not just confined to black homeowners and Latino homeowners, that was everybody. Yeah, to right. Your canary in the coal mine piece. Yeah. I would like to ask one more question and then turn it over to the audience. Are y'all ready to ask some questions? Okay, I'm gonna do one more. I'm gonna pose one more question to Dr. Brandi here, and then we'll open it up. Brandi, as a scholar of African American studies and Latin American history, what do you think we need to get right when we're teaching about the African American experience? Because, by the way, quietly, Dr. Brandi Waters has one of the biggest platforms in the United States to actually teach about the African American experience as the primary architect of this course. What do we have to get right? No pressure. No pressure, because there are many things that we have to get right, but I'll focus on just one. I think understanding that this history and African American studies is not a form of propaganda, that it is an academic field that has developed interesting and important and research-based mechanisms to give us new insights about the human experience. When students understand that there are research practices, that there is evidence, that there are archives that they can dig into, and that they themselves can acquire the skills to analyze them and come to their own perspectives, that is one of the biggest things that we have to get right for students in this course. I know for me, I didn't have an opportunity to learn much about the African diaspora until I went to college, and that wasn't an experience that everyone in my own high school even had. And I was going there with a sense that I wanted to just learn about all the good things, like there are good things that black people did that I'm not learning about.
But what I really walked away with was a sense that I could become a person to look those things up. I could become a person that could read historical documents, that could put together different pieces, that could learn to understand where these stories are coming from in literature and film, how to read data, how to look for limitations in charts, how to unearth these false narratives that are perpetuated. So whether I chose to become a historian or not, I enjoyed that experience as a freshman because it was empowering, and it let me know it's not that there's a right narrative and a wrong narrative to believe in, but there are new narratives that we can uncover when we have the skills and look for the evidence.
All right.
Terrific.
Who is the brave person who will ask the first question? We'll go for the young lady in the yellow, and then we will go to you second. Please.
Where's the young lady in the yellow? Hey, young lady.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd just like to thank you all for the marriage of this content with the College Board and Education and the AP curriculum. As a New York State legislator who is trying to pass a Amistad Act that would give all children access from K to 12 to African American studies, this, I hope, will be a marriage that will enlighten so many others. I represent the 56th Assembly District, which is in Brooklyn. It is contains two neighborhoods, Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. And if anybody has seen Who We Are, A Chronicle of Race in America, you saw us highlighted as one of the most redlined and, of course, now gentrified neighborhoods in all of the United States. And so this film just really meant so much to me. So my quick question is, can I talk to you afterwards? Because I need you all to come to Brooklyn and show this film so we can have this conversation and continue to do the work. So that's one thing. But I have so much to say, so I'm gonna just try to get down to it. The shame of Chicago, right? So it's a double entendre. Certainly the shame being on those who speculated against our community, but what resonates with me as we struggle with deed theft and all sorts of things that are going on in our community, it is the shame that people feel from being fleeced out of their money, out of their wealth, that also keeps us back, right? And so that's why the educational piece of this is so important. I tell my colleagues all the time, you can legislate, but you have to first educate, because the legislation, most people don't even know about it. We pass 1,000 bills a week sometimes, so nobody has the opportunity to even read what should protect them. And we've had fair housing laws on the books for over 60 years, and we're still being redlined in districts, right? So I appreciate your work, Brandi. But I want to talk about that woman who was brave enough to raise her hand and say, I'm going to tell the story about how I was fleeced so other people can do that. How do we continue, or anybody can, how do we continue to ask people to come out of the shadows and tell their stories so we don't have to figure out ways to protect them because we don't even know what's going on with them? Did any of that kind of come up in this discussion, and will you kind of cover that topic as we go on to the fifth episode in this series? Sorry for the very, very long question, but I have a lot to say about this. But this is a brilliant piece, and I loved it. Thank you.
I'll start briefly. I think you're touching on something that's so important, and it's actually something that historians themselves run into. Just as a brief aside, there's a very good book called Jim Crow Wisdom by Jonathan Holloway, who's now the president of Rutgers University. And he's a historian who also talks about how when he wanted to uncover his own family's experience during Jim Crow, no one would tell him anything within his own family. So he thought to himself, if we don't know our own personal stories, how does anyone know at scale what's been happening across the country? So I think it is a challenge to ask people to step into their shame, to be comfortable. And for me, I think it's really thinking about what you gain from it. It's the liberation of the folks who stand to make a change, who can make a change that can affect the people who experience those things, and who can also make sure they're not replicated in the future. So I think also recognizing, to your point, that these are systems, that this is something that was designed to attack you, and that there is strength in standing in what would have felt like shame so that you can make some kind of change moving forward, so that you can make sure that these are not stories that go untold, that they can't be perpetuated because we now know what to look for. So those are the ways that I think I've seen some historians think about what it means to step into those feelings and also think about what we lose when we keep the Jim Crow wisdom quiet.
I mean, that's a great point. Thank you for your question. I mean, so 2 weeks ago, I'm telling my father everything about this. He's like, "Oh yeah, your grandmother was, was in the house with a contract binding in Cleveland." I was like, "Wait a minute, what?" I was like, "My grandmother was a victim of the contract binding." He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Never thought to talk about it, huh?" Like, and it was bizarre because my father is, smart guy, academician, the whole thing. I know a lot about my grandmother, but I never knew that. And so, so part of it is exactly what Brandi's saying. But I got to say, like, the tools that we have now are helping, I think, just in terms of the 23andMe stuff and all the genealogy. I mean, my good friend Rachel Swarns is writing books. She wrote a book about Michelle Obama and her sort of lineage, and then is now doing something on sort of genealogy and lineages and, the movement of black folks who are now really starting to confront, so where we're from all the way back to Africa. And I think all of that is part of, at least, part of this recognition that, we can start breaking apart these histories, our personal histories, which can lead to, a broader history telling, and like Brandi's saying, at scale. So I think, technology is definitely helping that, I think. And then the technology to be able to tell the story, I mean, anybody can be a filmmaker, iPhone, do some digging, and you've got yourself a film, So I think that also is part of, sort of the next wave of storytelling, personal storytelling, which can lead to bigger and better sort of recognition of the sort of things you're talking about.
We want to be good guests, so we're going to take one more question from the young lady right here.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question, and thank you for this film. I wanted to say that there were two terms that I've heard this afternoon that came to mind and stick with me. One is reconciliation, and the other is equity. I'll first say that I'm an educator with a boarding school in the Midwest, largest boarding school in the Midwest. So when we talk about privilege and access and opportunity, I see it in so many ways. But when we talk about reconciliation with this film, I think it has the ability to reconcile many of the wrongs that have been done to our community. But most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge when we talk about the College Board and AP and how this course could drive this narrative of how we can expose truth. My question is, I'm wondering if there is opportunity for us to not only do this with the students, but with educators. I, particularly in my responsibilities, I teach educators, and I've used Race, the Power of an Illusion. And that curriculum is so broad and so in its approach to how we develop an understanding, but questions to ask, and like I said, a whole curriculum. How are we going to expose our educators, not only our children and our youth, who are lucky enough to be able to take an AP course, but how do we take this far beyond AP and expose a curriculum that is conducive to youth as well as educators and the community at large? That's the question.
I'm happy to start. I'm so glad that you mentioned that this is something that goes far beyond AP. This is something that all of us participate in, building teacher capacity and understanding to be able to teach these materials as they become available in a really useful and impactful way. I see AP as an opportunity to contribute to that work and to really elevate it and to kind of kick the ball moving forward. Because part of what AP has is a platform that is national that builds in teacher preparation for each particular course. So as we continue to research, design, reiterate, and roll out this course, we have an opportunity to work with folks like you and partners that we hope that you share with us who will participate in that teacher capacity element, that piece that helps them to pause, reflect, think about their own biases, think about what they have to unlearn, think about how they are approaching a new field with these intended outcomes of increasing inclusivity, increasing equity, bringing more voices to the table, and also fostering really healthy debate that is rooted in facts. These are not things that they can necessarily just show up to the table with because they've maybe been trained in an informal way to teach a different kind of history class. African American studies is distinct, but as you mentioned, this is something that all teachers need for every course that they're teaching. So I hope that you all will continue to give us feedback, share with us those really useful experiences that you've had, those transformative programs, so that we can pass them on to our teachers and then also build it into our own teacher training workshops that we have for teachers of AP African American Studies.
And also to build on what Brandi said, my hope is that this course is part of a broader movement. So I think the former Chancellor of Washington, D.C. Public Schools, Kaya Henderson, I believe she's in the audience, and she has an organization called Reconstruction, which is parallel to this. It's curricula for children younger than and through high school age. We were at a Color of Change carnival yesterday, and they had all kinds of African American studies content for very small children. So if we all support each other in trying to tell our stories, this is going to move well beyond a College Board AP course. We want to be good guests. We're a little bit past our time. We want to thank the organizers of the Martha's Vineyard African American Film Fest, which is celebrating their 20th anniversary. It's gone from something really small to something really big. And buy your tickets and tell your friends. And thanks to Chris Jenkins and Dr. Brandi Waters.